Vigilante Williamson here with a very simple question. What did you think of the Batman trailer? I liked it personally, but I'm going to do as this title says and give 5 things that I want out of this new movie. I know that there's probably a lot of different opinions on it. I know majority it was a positive outlook, but there's still things that I want from this movie and I'm hoping happen in this movie. The number one thing, and the thing that the trailer kind of implies, is a detective story. For far too long, we have not gotten a world's greatest detective Batman. I think a lot of people feel like we've never got a complete Batman, and that's because there's so many elements to Batman that putting them all in a movie, we haven't seen a complete package. We've seen parts of it. I think a lot of people who hated Ben Affleck as Batman really liked his costume. I think a lot of people that liked Christian Bale as Batman really didn't like the fact that that world didn't really exist in the DC world. There was no Killer Crocs running around. There was no Bane. I mean, there was a Bane, but it wasn't the same type of Bane where he could be this supernaturally big, supernaturally strong character. There was none of that in Nolan's universe, even though I love those movies, and I think they're some of the best movies, period, not just Batman movies. Particular Batman Begins and The Dark Knight. The Dark Knight Rises I kind of love, ironically, but I'll go there in another video, I'm sure. My point is, each series that we've gotten from Batman, including the Keaton, including Adam West, whatever you want to say, has been incomplete. Maybe the Batman the animated series being the most complete depiction of Batman, but we haven't gotten that in live action. Having a detective element, even though it won't provide the complete perspective of Batman, is a great start into getting the complete Batman that we all want, even though you can argue there's maybe an oversaturation with Batman at the moment. The number 2 thing I want to do with this movie may sound counterintuitive, but I want them to take advantage of Robert Pattinson's body. I think one of the most controversial things about this movie and about Robert Pattinson as Bruce Wayne / Batman is his physique. A lot of people have defended him and said, hey, Michael Keaton wasn't necessarily a bodybuilder. A lot of people try to compare his physique to Christian Bale, but I think Christian Bale was a decent amount bigger than Robert Pattinson is. That said, he actually has added weight, believe it or not, because he's a really skinny guy. He's probably, I would guess, 170, 180 right now. He's usually about 140. So for him to add any weight is probably a big deal with him. And I think something else needs to be added with that. Listen, a lot of people in Hollywood have ways of achieving this type of size that we're used to for a Hollywood actor. And to be quite frank, that's not necessarily health-wise the best decision. So I can't get upset of an actor for putting that out there because, yeah, it may sound like a guy being lazy, but a lot of times it's a guy just saying, hey, I'm not going to do what everyone else does to get big for these roles, and I can understand that. So I'm not going to get mad at that. However, I don't think just because he's a more slight Bruce Wayne, it has to be a disadvantage. In fact, look at UFC fighters. I mean, Conor McGregor, he's obviously a smaller guy, but he's a lot shorter than Robert Pattinson. I think Robert Pattinson is about 6'1". So maybe even somebody like John Bones Jones. You know what I mean? Granted, I think he's still a lot skinnier than John Jones. But my point is, there are fighters who are a lot more slight. He doesn't have to be a bodybuilder, but he should be a fighter. So if he's not going to put work in on the gym per se, he should be, at least as far as his combat training, to look and feel like Batman. I think the most impressive part of the trailer was his brutal beatdown and the I'm Vengeance line. That's what got a lot of people excited. So he should be a physically fit fighter, even if he's not the bodybuilder that everybody wants him to be. Take advantage of a slight body. Every fighter, and in fact most fighters, are not built like bodybuilders. They have more slender, more manageable builds, and I think that can be taken advantage of with the way Robert Pattinson looks. Another thing is something I want them to watch out for. I don't want this movie to be so steeped in realism that it doesn't allow the fantasy and comic book elements that make Batman so great. I said earlier about the Nolanverse, even though I love those movies, The Dark Knight is my favorite movie of all time. Not necessarily the best movie, but definitely my favorite. but they're so real that you can't have a Killer Croc. You can't have a real Ra's al Ghul that lives for hundreds and hundreds of years. All of these fantasy characters had to be put into a reality-based shell, and even though it came off well for the context of those movies, I want to see a Batman that can still exist in a comic book world. Even though I want a gritty, dark, Seven-like detective story, it doesn't mean you can't at least hint to elements like a Solomon Grundy existing in this universe. I want this to feel like a fantasy, sci-fi comic book movie, even though it's a detective story. And you don't have to overdo it. You don't have to make it too loony that it goes over the rails, but just enough that you can understand that this is still a comic book movie, even though I still want a dark detective story. Another thing is, don't necessarily focus in on Robert Pattinson or Bruce Wayne. I think he's the most controversial part of this movie, but there's so many great elements of it. I think he doesn't necessarily have to be the star. I'll reference the Nolanverse once more. As much as I love these movies, I think the villains were a huge part of it, especially The Dark Knight itself. I think the villains need to be a huge part of this series as well. Not only that, but the world of Gotham itself. One thing I kind of like about this is Gotham feels dark and moody. If Nolan's Gotham was Chicago, not just because it was actually Chicago, but it felt like it could have been just another major city outside New York that was still a major metropolitan city that had its fair share or greater than its fair share of crime. This feels like a 90s Seattle or Vancouver or Portland, just Pacific Northwest, or even Liverpool, which I think is where it's actually shot. Just a dark, rainy city that has depression embedded into it. So it just gives an extra layer to the dark, grimy crime of Gotham, and I like that touch. And I think that atmosphere, the villains, the rogue gallery, I spoke before about having hints towards the fantasy elements that are inherent to comic books, or the sci-fi elements that are inherent to comic books, have this world shine so much that Robert Pattinson doesn't have to do much. I've compared this to like being a game manager quarterback for anyone who still cares about sports ball. Let everything else shine so he doesn't have to be a superhero. It's a superhero movie. That doesn't mean take away from his role as Batman. In fact, I think if you focus more on the other elements, his acting skill, because he is supposedly a good actor. I'm not going to act like I saw all his movies. I didn't even see Twilight. But people say he's a good actor, so let him show it in smaller bunches. I think you should have enough plot going on where it doesn't have to be Bruce Wayne brooding for 30 minutes. You know what I mean? Show the Penguin's plot. Show the Riddler's plot. Show, I think Hush may even be rumored to be in this movie. Show what Catwoman is doing. Show this world. Show Gotham and Batman as the defender of Gotham. And that's going to lead into my fifth point. Do not make Batman weak. He should not be someone who's learning on the job. He should be a complete Batman whose world is getting bigger. I don't want to see him stumbling around. We already had Batman Begins. I know this is supposed to be a year 2 story, but he can still feel like a Batman that is completely adept at being Batman. If this is supposed to be like Arkham Origins, the game, the movie, then have it be like that. I mean, yeah, he'll make some mistakes, but for the most part, he's a complete Batman. I forgot to do this during the video, but I wanted to take the time out to mention A Long Halloween. It's my favorite Batman story, and it's a year 2 going into year 3 story. It's also a perfect example of Batman not being completely weak or too naive. He's pretty well established. His rogues gallery is pretty well established, but the world around him expands as far as crime in Gotham. The Long Halloween is also a perfect example of what I was speaking about earlier. It's a detective story at its heart, and it keeps the fantastic elements of a comic book well. It tells the story of a serial killer, it has crime families, and ultimately it ends up with the old crime families being replaced by the supervillains. It's a really good story. Again, it's my favorite story, and it's a great example of a young Batman that's not a weak Batman or a naive one. This should be year 2 only from the standpoint that the world around him is getting more distorted. He's having to deal with supervillains and having to deal with the reaction to Batman as an entity in Gotham, but not as he still needs to learn basic things. It's okay for his equipment to be lo-fi. I think a lot of people are interested in that, but Batman should be able to kick ass from the beginning of this film on to the end. He should be the world's greatest detective. He should already show his adeptness. It's okay for him to stumble along the way. We need a hero's journey, but don't have Batman completely clueless, having to learn along the way. Don't get any woke elements where maybe Selena Kyle has to teach him how to be Batman. Just have him be a complete Batman in which we're seeing the story of Gotham unfold, seeing the greater threat of villain that is a reaction to Batman, and not necessarily a weak Batman who's finding his way. Also, 2 extra points. 1, don't try to reinvent the wheel. I know I've given a whole bunch of material, but there's a lot about Batman that's already good. I think one of the best things about him is he's already a natural, malleable character, but I don't think we necessarily need some new take or some distortion of what Batman is. Have a standard Batman story, have a detective story, have it hint to other elements, have a complete package in which Bruce Wayne just inhabits, but don't come up with something crazy or outlandish like a lot of franchises have done just to make their mark, where the new creators who have this property have to make their mark. And my last and final piece of advice is to lean into the hard R. If you're going to have a rated R Batman, have a rated R Batman. This should basically be 7, except with Gotham. We don't even know what the theater situation is going to be like when this film actually comes out. Who knows? We could be completely on video on demand as a complete product by then, in which case a hard R I don't think is going to hurt it as much. Feel free to make whatever you need to make with no inhibitions and lean into that hard R. So that's my last piece of advice. I know I did more than 5. So let me know what you think about the Batman trailer. Are there too many Batman running around? Because we have this Batman, we have the Justice League Batman, which has Ben Affleck, who is also going to be in Flash with another Batman, which is Michael Keaton returning for the Flash. So is this too much? Is this going to confuse the fan? Or are we just enough? Are you just such a Batman fan like I am that you just want more? I think you can't get on the verge of overexposure, but we'll see. And you let me know. So if you like the video, please like the video. If you love it or hate it, please let me know in the comments below. If you feel so obliged to share and subscribe, I would love it and appreciate it. And even if you do none of these things, thank you for watching and thank you for your time.